this segment, I'd like to describe the relativization structures, strategies, and hierarchy. And we're here at clauses 124, which produces the man who saw John saw Mary. Here's the relative clause. It's modifying the head noun, which in this case is man. And here in the semantic representation we can see the man, this is the head noun, then it's modified by this relative clause, and the relative clause will always have a noun that's co-referential with the head noun. In TBTA we know that they're co-referential. You may recall from an earlier segment I mentioned the noun list index. So if you look at that pop-up, the noun list index is 1 for this man, and the noun list index for this man, this concept man, is also 1. So we know that these two concepts are referring to the same man. Let's go look at our relativization structure, strategies, and hierarchy dialogue. And linguists have done a great deal of typological research with respect to relative clauses, and they found that they can be divided into two broad categories: embedded and adjoined. If a language employs embedded relative clauses, like English does, that means the relative clause is embedded within the noun phrase that it's modifying. Embedded relative clauses may be either prenominal, meaning that the relative clause occurs before the head noun, postnominal, meaning that the relative clause occurs after the head noun, or circumnominal, meaning that the relative clause contains the noun that's being modified. English uses postnominal. Now, these options are here just so that you can describe your relative clauses accurately. The actual position of the relative clause in the final surface text is always dependent upon the phrase structure rules. It's the phrase structure rules that always determine final constituent order. So it's up to you in your phrase structure rules to position your relative clauses appropriately. These are here just so that you can describe your relative clauses accurately. Let's look at adjoined. If a language employs adjoined relative clauses, then they may either be sentence initial or sentence final. If we click OK right now, you'll see that the relative clause has been moved out of the noun phrase, and here it is, sentence initial. And if you look at the last line of the pop-up, it says moved by relative clause structures adjoined. But again, it's up to your phrase structure rule to position the relative clauses appropriately. Now, if you use adjoined relative clauses, generally there's a trace. Your language will have a trace in the noun phrase that contains the head noun. And we need to indicate our head noun, so you have this option here. We need to insert a value here, so we go to our feature set dialog. We've seen this before. In this case, we're going to go to nouns and then surface realization. Let's add two values: restrictive relative clause trace and descriptive relative clause trace. Now when we go here, those two values are available for us. So for value inserted into trace's surface realization feature in restrictive relative clauses, we're going to select this value. Value inserted into trace's surface realization feature in descriptive relative clauses, we're going to select this feature. And now if we click OK and we rest our cursor here, you see in the pop-up towards the bottom, surface realization equals restrictive relative clause trace. And now your spell-out rules can see that value and add an appropriate trace if your language uses adjoined relative clauses. Let's go back. We're most familiar with embedded relative clauses. That's what English uses. So let's go with this option for now. And now let's go to this tab, the relativization strategies and hierarchy. Linguists have found that there's a hierarchy that relative clauses can be formed on: subject, object, indirect object, oblique, genitive, and object of comparison. And linguists have also found that there are two types of relative clauses are restrictive relative clauses, which serve to identify an unknown referent, and descriptive relative clauses, which serve to provide additional information about a known referent. Now here, genitive, these constructions aren't allowed in the semantic representations. An example of a relative clause formed on a genitive is something like, the man whose book I borrowed lives in Dallas. That whose book I borrowed, that's a relative clause formed on a genitive, and many languages don't permit those, so we don't permit them in the semantic representations. And the same is true with object of comparison. An example of a relative clause formed on an object of comparison is something like, the man that John is taller than lives in Dallas. There, that John is taller than, that's a relative clause formed on an object of comparison. And again, many languages don't permit those, so we don't permit them in the semantic representations. We do permit relative clauses to be formed on subjects, objects, indirect objects, and obliques. And for each of these there's a button, and we need to specify the grammatical relation or grammatical relations that we want included in that category. And you may recall from an earlier segment that we added a rule which generates grammatical relations from semantic roles, and that rule adds these particular grammatical relations. You can add to this list. You may want subject which is an agent, and subject which is an experiencer, and subject which is a force, or various types of objects, etc. So you can add to your list of grammatical relations, and when you do, you'll need to specify which ones you want classified as subjects, which ones as objects, etc. But for now, we're going to select this option. For object, we'll select object. For indirect object, indirect object. And oblique, we're going to select all of these. And we need to do the same thing for descriptive relative clauses. Okay. Linguists have also observed that languages employ 4 different strategies for encoding the NP-rel, the noun inside the relative clause that's co-referential with the head noun, the noun being modified. One strategy is non-reduction, meaning that the full noun occurs within the relative clause. Another option is the gap strategy, meaning that the NP-rel, the noun inside the relative clause, is deleted from the surface structure. English uses that strategy. Another option is pronoun retention, meaning that a regular pronoun, a personal pronoun, is used in the relative clause. Another option is a relative pronoun. It's a pronoun, but it's a special category. It's not a regular personal pronoun like you or he or we. It's a relative pronoun. If you select the relative pronoun option, then you'll see down here, value inserted into noun surface realization feature for relative pronouns. A value is automatically added for us. If we look here, if we go back now to nouns, surface realization, another value has been added for us called relative pronoun. And then your pronoun spell-out rules or your noun spell-out rules can look at this feature value and generate the proper surface form. Let's go with gap strategy. That's what English uses for restrictive relative clauses. For descriptive relative clauses, we use a relative pronoun. If your language employs a relativizer, then you can select this option and enter a relativizer. Now in English we have several relativizers. The most generic is that. Let's do that for all of these. But as I mentioned, English has some other relativizers. For example, who, the man who saw John saw Mary, that who is a relativizer when it's modifying a person. We use when the relative clause modifies a time. For example, the year when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon was 1969. We use where if the relative clause is modifying a place. For example, the city where I live is Dallas. So that relative clause is where I live, and that's modifying a place, city, so we use where. But those special case relativizers have to be inserted by special rules. At this stage, all we can do is insert the most generic relativizer, which in English is that. You can see now that the relativizer has been inserted for us. These rules, just like the preceding rules in the transfer grammar, they're executed even before the semantic representation is displayed. And when we make changes here in these rules, they're displayed immediately. So we see the relativizer has been inserted. We see that the NP-rel in the relative clause, in this case man, has been deleted, and the pop-up tells us man was deleted by structural adjustment rule, restrictive relative clause strategies for subject. That concludes this particular segment.